I'm not a murderer. I'm not a murderer.
Later, another chain, laying out undergarments.
We live in an age where everything is archived, everything is uploaded, everything exists somewhere on a server or a hard drive or a cloud, and the idea that something can just disappear feels almost impossible. But it happens. And sometimes the reason something disappears is because someone looked at what was captured and decided that the world was better off never seeing it, because what was on that tape or that file or that broadcast was so dangerous, so incriminating, or so deeply disturbing that its very existence was a threat to someone's freedom, someone's reputation, or someone's ability to sleep at night. These are pieces of lost media connected to real crimes, real cover-ups, and real deaths. Some were hidden deliberately, some were destroyed, some vanished under circumstances that remain completely unexplained to this day. And in at least one case, a piece of lost media might hold the key to solving a murder that's gone cold for over 2 decades. Except the episode has disappeared so completely that proving it ever existed is almost impossible. Let's begin. In May of 1989, a British television program called Bullseye aired an episode that at the time nobody thought twice about. And I mean nobody. The format of the show was about as simple as television gets. 3 teams of 2 people competed by throwing darts and answering trivia questions. The kind of light-hearted evening entertainment that families across the UK watched while eating dinner and not really paying attention. The kind of show your nan had on in the background while she did the crossword. It was hosted by Jim Bowen, a former comedian-turned-presenter who had this warm, avuncular presence that made the whole thing feel safe and comfortable and about as threatening as a cup of tea on a Sunday afternoon.
Here tonight, as he throws for charity, Bobby George. Best of luck, Bob. See us next week. We may keep it up throughout the year as you watch Bullseye every Sunday. See you soon.
The show had been running since 1981, and by 1989 it was a fixture of British television, basically cultural wallpaper, the kind of background noise that millions of people had on without ever really engaging with it, which is probably why nobody noticed anything strange about one particular contestant who showed up that night. His name was John Cooper. He was 44 years old, stocky, bearded, completely unremarkable in every way that matters for a game show. Just a regular guy from Pembrokeshire in Wales who'd shown up to throw some darts and maybe win a prize. At one point during the show, Bowen asked Cooper about his hobbies, the kind of softball question that presenters ask to fill time and make contestants seem relatable and human to the audience at home. You know, so John, what do you do when you're not throwing darts? And Cooper said he enjoyed outdoor activities, things like scuba diving and field sports in the coastal areas of Pembrokeshire, which sounds perfectly innocent when you're watching it on a Tuesday evening in 1989 and you have absolutely no idea who you're actually looking at.
You've got an unusual hobby, John, haven't you?
Oh, yes, the scuba diving.
The scuba diving. Well, apparently it's the place to do it down there, isn't it?
Oh, we've got coastline.
Because
He seemed relaxed, he smiled at the camera, he chatted with Bowen like any other contestant would, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing in his demeanor or his words or his body language that would suggest to anyone watching that this man was anything other than what he appeared to be, a middle-aged guy from Wales who liked the outdoors and thought he'd have a go at winning some prizes on the telly. Just a bloke. Just a normal, harmless bloke. Cooper and his partner didn't do particularly well that night. They scored the lowest of all the teams. Bowen gave them one last chance to redeem themselves with a final throw. They couldn't pull it off, and they went home empty-handed. The episode aired, a few million people watched it without a second thought, and then it disappeared into the BBC archives like thousands of other game show episodes from that era. Forgotten, unremarkable, just another half hour of television that nobody had any reason to remember or preserve or think about ever again. Except someone did have a reason to remember it, and that reason wouldn't become clear for almost 2 decades. Because here's the thing about John Cooper. He wasn't just some guy who liked darts and scuba diving, not even close. In 1985, 4 years before he appeared on Bullseye smiling at the camera and chatting about his hobbies like the world's most boring dinner party guest, Cooper had broken into a farmhouse in Pembrokeshire, owned by 2 siblings named Richard and Helen Thomas. Richard was 58 years old and Helen was 54, and they'd been living quietly on their farm called Scoveston Park, this remote property tucked away in the Welsh countryside where nothing ever happened, when Cooper showed up with a shotgun. He'd been watching the property for days, maybe longer, casing it, learning their routines, figuring out when they'd be most vulnerable, and when the surrounding roads would be emptiest, basically doing recon on 2 people who had absolutely no idea they were being hunted, and when he finally went inside, he killed both of them with the shotgun and then set the entire farmhouse on fire to destroy any evidence of what he'd done, because of course he did. Because why leave a crime scene intact when you can just burn it to the ground and let the fire department sort out whatever's left? When firefighters arrived and put out the blaze, they found the Thomas siblings' bodies, but the fire had done so much damage to the scene that investigators couldn't determine exactly what had happened. The evidence was too compromised. The forensic tools of the 1980s weren't sophisticated enough to extract usable information from a fire-damaged crime scene, and for years the prevailing theory among authorities was that the siblings had died in some kind of tragic domestic incident, maybe even a murder-suicide. The case went cold. The file went into a drawer, and John Cooper, who had just murdered 2 people in their own home, walked away completely free. And he didn't stop. He didn't lay low, didn't flee the country, didn't even have the decency to look nervous about it. He went right back to his life. He worked, he socialized, he appeared on a game show, he threw darts on national television while Jim Bowen asked him about his hobbies, and nobody suspected a thing because why would they? He was just a guy. He was the kind of person you'd pass on the street without looking twice, the kind of face that blends into a crowd and never gets remembered, and that anonymity was his greatest weapon. More effective than the shotgun, honestly. In June of 1989, just weeks after his bullseye appearance, Cooper took his shotgun to the Pembrokeshire coastal path, the exact same area where he'd told Jim Bowen he liked to go diving, the same stretch of beautiful Welsh coastline he'd casually mentioned on camera as his favorite spot for outdoor activities. And I need you to really sit with that for a second because it's genuinely chilling. This man described his hunting ground on national television disguised as a hobby, and he waited. Peter and Gwenda Dixon, a married couple from Oxfordshire who were on a walking holiday in Pembrokeshire, happened to pass through that area on what should have been a peaceful afternoon hike, and Cooper ambushed them. He robbed Peter at gunpoint, demanded his bank cards and PIN numbers, took £300 in cash, and then decided that £300 wasn't enough, or maybe he'd always planned to do what he did next, regardless of how much money they handed over. He shot both of them and left their bodies on the coastal path. The Dixons weren't found for several days. By then, someone had already used Peter's stolen bank card at a local cash machine, and investigators were able to get a composite sketch drawn up based on witness descriptions of the person who'd used the card. But they couldn't connect the sketch to anyone in their databases, so the case stalled out alongside the Thomas murders, 2 separate double homicides in the same region of Wales that nobody realized were connected because there was no forensic link between them and no suspect who tied the cases together. 4 dead people, same killer, same county. And the police had absolutely nothing. Cooper kept going for years after that, because of course he did, because nobody was looking at him. In March of 1996, he ambushed a group of 5 teenagers in a field near his home, terrorized them at gunpoint, separated 2 girls from the group, and sexually assaulted them. He was eventually caught for that crime and for a string of over 30 burglaries he'd committed across Pembrokeshire, and in 1998 he was sentenced to 16 years in prison, which meant he was locked up and off the streets, but still hadn't been connected to the Thomas or Dixon murders because the forensic technology needed to make that connection simply didn't exist yet.
I'm not a murderer. I'm not a murderer. I am not a murderer.
That changed in the mid-2000s when a dedicated cold case review unit in Dyfed Powys Police started going back through old unsolved cases armed with new forensic methods that hadn't been available in the 1980s. DNA analysis had gotten exponentially more precise, fiber comparison techniques had evolved dramatically, and investigators could now extract usable biological and material evidence from items that had been sitting untouched in evidence lockers for decades, just waiting for science to catch up with reality. When they re-examined the physical evidence from the Thomas farmhouse case and the Dixon coastal path case, what they found connected everything. John Cooper's DNA was present at both scenes. Blood from Peter Dixon was found on Cooper's shotgun, the same weapon he'd used for years like some kind of serial killer heirloom. Fibers from Cooper's clothing matched fibers recovered from the Thomas crime scene and from the area where the Dixons' bodies had been found, creating a physical link between both double murders and the same perpetrator for the first time in 2 decades. And then someone on the investigation team made a discovery that would become one of the most chilling moments in the entire history of British criminal justice. And look, I don't use the word chilling lightly because every true crime YouTuber throws that word around like confetti, but this genuinely earns it. They found out that John Cooper had appeared on Bullseye in 1989, and when they pulled the surviving footage from the BBC archives, which was just a fragment of the original episode, barely a few minutes long because the rest had been lost or taped over in the intervening years, because apparently nobody at the BBC thought, hey, maybe we should keep all our tapes just in case one of the contestants turns out to be a serial killer. and they compared Cooper's face on screen to the composite sketch of the man who'd used Peter Dixon's stolen bank card at that cash machine. They were looking at the same person. The sketch and the game show footage lined up almost perfectly. The facial structure, the beard, the build, all of it matching in a way that went beyond coincidence and into the realm of definitive identification. The evidence connecting Cooper to the Dixon murders had been sitting in a television archive for nearly 20 years, a piece of lost media that nobody knew was a piece of criminal evidence until forensic science caught up with what had been hiding in plain sight all along. Cooper was convicted in 2011 of both double murders, the sexual assaults on the teenagers, and a litany of other crimes. He was formally diagnosed as a psychopath by the forensic psychiatrists who evaluated him, which I'm sure shocked absolutely no one who'd been following the case, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison with no possibility of parole. Only a fragment of that Bullseye episode still exists today. The rest of the program where John Cooper appeared, chatted pleasantly with Jim Bowen, smiled at the camera, threw darts, talked about his love for the Welsh coastline, where he'd ambushed and killed people just weeks before, and would ambush and kill people again just weeks after. That footage has never resurfaced. It's lost media in the most deeply unsettling sense imaginable. A piece of routine, forgettable television that inadvertently captured a serial killer hiding in plain sight, while millions of people watched, and nobody, not the host, not the audience, not the producers, not the other contestants, had any idea what they were looking at. Let that sink in. You could have been eating dinner, watching this man smile and throw darts, and you were looking at a murderer who'd killed 4 people and was about to go kill more, and you would have had no idea. Nobody did. On April 15th, 1989, there was a football match between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, South Yorkshire. It was an FA Cup semi-final, one of the biggest fixtures in English football, which meant the stadium was going to be absolutely packed, which meant crowd control was going to be critical, which meant that every single decision made by the police and stadium officials that afternoon was going to matter in ways that nobody could have fully predicted, but absolutely should have been prepared for. Spoiler alert, they weren't prepared. Not even remotely. The problems at Hillsborough didn't start on April 15th, and that's the thing that makes this whole disaster even more infuriating. Back in 1981, a crush at the same stadium during another semi-final had injured 38 people, which should have triggered comprehensive safety reforms, but instead led to a redesign that somehow made things worse, which is an achievement in incompetence that deserves some kind of award. Metal fences and barriers were installed to separate sections of the standing terraces, but here's the thing. The whole thing was designed to prevent pitch invasions and control hooliganism, which was the obsession of English football authorities in the 1980s, rather than to, keep people alive in an emergency. The fences turned the standing areas into pens, confined spaces with high metal barriers on all sides, and almost no exits. If those pens got overcrowded, there was literally nowhere for people to go. They'd essentially turned a football stadium into a cage, and then congratulated themselves on solving the hooliganism problem. Brilliant.
As they tried to come out from behind the barriers, people at the front were
On the day of the semi-final, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and then some stuff that nobody had even considered going wrong also went wrong. Thousands of Liverpool supporters arrived late because of delayed trains and congested roads, and they started accumulating outside the turnstile area at the Leppings Lane end of the stadium. The police officers assigned to manage the crowd were catastrophically unprepared. The commanding officer, Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, had never overseen a match of this size before, having been assigned to the role just weeks earlier, and as the crowd outside grew denser and more desperate to get in before kickoff, nobody on the ground had a clear plan for what to do about it. Nobody had a plan A, let alone a plan B, and we were way past needing a plan C. By 2:35 p.m., the area outside the turnstiles had become genuinely dangerous. At 2:52 p.m., Duckenfield made a decision that would haunt English football forever. He ordered the opening of Gate C, a large exit gate that bypassed the turnstile system entirely, and allowed fans to flood directly into the stadium without any controlled flow. Approximately 2,000 people surged through that gate and poured into the central pens of the Leppings Lane Terrace, which were already at capacity because, wait for it, nobody had thought to close the access tunnel leading to those pens before opening the gate. Nobody. Not one person in the entire chain of command thought, hey, maybe before we funnel 2,000 people into this area, we should check if there's actually room for them. Within minutes, the situation became catastrophic. People at the front of the central pens were being crushed against the metal perimeter fences with no way to escape, compressed by the weight of thousands of bodies being pushed forward by the crowd behind them. People were falling and being trampled. Children were being lifted above the crush by desperate parents trying to pass them over the fences to safety. And the police officers on the pitch side of the fences, the ones who should have been the first to respond, the ones whose literal job it was to protect these people, initially believed they were dealing with a pitch invasion rather than a life-threatening crush. So instead of opening the gates to let people escape onto the pitch where there was space and air, they were pushing fans back into the pens where people were dying. They were herding people back into the crush. They were pushing dying people back toward death because they thought it was a crowd control issue rather than a mass casualty event. 97 people lost their lives. The youngest was 10 years old. 10. 76 more were seriously injured. The match was stopped 6 minutes after kickoff, but by then the damage was irreversibly done, and 6 minutes is an eternity when people are being crushed to death 30 feet from a perfectly empty football pitch. And this is where the story transforms from a disaster into something much, much darker, because what happened after Hillsborough is almost as disturbing as what happened during it, and it connects directly to one of the most unsettling pieces of lost media in British history. And South Yorkshire Police immediately began constructing a narrative that blamed the fans for the disaster.
So on behalf of the government, and indeed our country, I am profoundly sorry that this double injustice has been left uncorrected for so long.
Duckenfield, the same man who had ordered Gate C opened without any plan for managing the flow of people into the already overcrowded pens, the guy who had been in charge for literally weeks and had no idea what he was doing, told FA officials within minutes of the disaster that Liverpool fans had forced the gate open themselves, which was a lie, a provable lie, a brazen, shameless lie that he told while people were still dying on the terraces behind him. This narrative was fed to the media, and the media, because this was the 1980s and apparently fact-checking was optional, ran with it. The Sun newspaper infamously published it under the headline "The Truth," claiming that fans had pickpocketed the dead, urinated on police officers, and attacked rescue workers, all of which was fabricated or distorted beyond recognition to protect the police from accountability. Because of course it was. Because when you've just caused the deaths of 97 people through your own catastrophic incompetence, the obvious move is to blame the dead people. But here's the thing that should have blown the whole cover-up apart from the very beginning. Hillsborough Stadium had an extensive CCTV surveillance system. Multiple cameras covered the stadium, including several pointed directly at the Leppings Lane entrance, the turnstile area, and the pens where the fatal crush occurred. Those cameras should have captured everything. The build-up of the crowd, the opening of Gate C, the surge into the pens, the police response, the exact moment when officers pushed fans back into the crush instead of helping them escape. That footage should have been the definitive, unchallengeable, case-closed forever record of what actually happened and who was actually responsible. Except when investigators went looking for those tapes, they were told that several of the cameras hadn't been recording that day, or that the tapes had been lost, or that they simply couldn't be located. Which is a remarkable coincidence. That the cameras covering the exact areas where the police made their most catastrophic decisions just happened to have their tapes go missing in the days after the disaster. Just incredibly convenient timing for everyone involved in causing the deaths of 97 people, wouldn't you say? But a man named Roger Holdsworth, a video technician responsible for the CCTV system at Hillsborough that day, came forward years later with testimony that contradicted everything the police had claimed. He said he had personally watched the cameras operating on April 15th, that they were recording normally, functioning perfectly fine, and that in the hours after the disaster he had physically extracted the tapes from the recording equipment to prevent them from being automatically overwritten by the system's routine recording cycle. He stored them in a locked cabinet, to protect them as evidence, because he understood, even in the chaos of that day, that those tapes were important. And then 2 of those tapes vanished. They were there, and then they weren't. Gone. Just like that. Nobody has ever been able to explain who took them, when they were taken, where they went, or why. Nobody has ever been held accountable for their disappearance. Nobody has even been formally accused. The tapes just stopped existing, and everyone kind of shrugged and moved on. The tapes that did survive showed a partial picture of what happened that day, enough to contradict major elements of the police narrative, but the missing ones, those are the tapes that many people believe contained the most damning evidence of police failure, the clearest footage of the decisions that directly caused the crush, and the most direct contradiction of the lie that Liverpool fans were to blame for their own deaths. And it goes deeper than just the missing CCTV footage, because when you start pulling on this thread, the whole thing unravels in the most disgusting way imaginable. Independent investigations eventually revealed that South Yorkshire Police had systematically altered witness statements given in the aftermath of the disaster, changing testimony that was critical of the police response and replacing it with language that supported the official narrative blaming the fans. Over 160 individual statements were amended in this way, which goes far beyond a few bad actors covering their tracks and into the territory of a coordinated, deliberate conspiracy to pervert the course of justice on an industrial scale. 160 statements. That's not a rogue officer. That's not a panicked supervisor. That's an institution deciding collectively that protecting its reputation was more important than 97 dead people and their families' right to know the truth. And if they were willing to alter written statements on that scale, with that level of coordination, what else were they willing to do? What else did they do? The Hillsborough Independent Panel, which finally examined the full body of evidence decades later, concluded definitively that the fans were not responsible for the disaster and that the police had engaged in a systematic cover-up, but the missing CCTV tapes have never been found. Whatever was on them, whatever they showed, whoever took them from that locked cabinet, that truth died with those tapes. Or it's sitting in a box somewhere waiting for someone to find it. And at this point, more than 35 years later, the chances of that happening grow smaller with every passing year. And the families of the 97? They waited decades for justice, decades, while the institution that killed their loved ones spent those decades lying about it. On July 12, 2014, a young woman named Brooke Slocum posted an ad on Craigslist. She was 18 years old, she lived in the Grand Rapids area of Michigan, she was 8 months pregnant, and she needed money. Now, the ad itself was straightforward enough on the surface, but the reality behind it was considerably darker than any casual browser of Craigslist listings would have imagined. Because according to people who knew Brooke well, she wasn't posting these ads by choice. Her boyfriend, a 25-year-old man named Charles Oppenheer, was the one pressuring her into offering intimate encounters in exchange for cash. Charles accompanied Brooke to these meetings, acting as something between a protector and an enforcer, and the whole arrangement was the kind of desperate, exploitative situation that exists in the shadows of American life, where poverty and manipulation and vulnerability intersect in ways that most people are fortunate enough to never encounter firsthand. Just a terrible situation all around. The kind of thing that shouldn't exist but does because the world is often an awful place. The ad sat without a response for a while, but on July 12th at approximately 10:59 p.m., Brooke received an email from someone using the name Mike's Heart. The message was a response to one of her recent listings, and Mike proposed meeting that very same night. Brooke, who was desperate enough for money to agree to a late-night meeting with a total stranger while 8 months pregnant, said yes. She and Charles drove together to Gezon Park in Wyoming, Michigan, a small park surrounded by residential streets that would have been quiet and mostly empty at that hour, and they arrived around midnight. A few minutes later, a man showed up, and the encounter went sideways almost immediately, violently and irreversibly. The man who'd been calling himself Mike grabbed Brooke, physically restrained her, and forced her into his vehicle. Charles, who'd been standing nearby, tried to intervene, tried to pull the man off of Brooke, tried to do something, anything, to stop what was happening, but Mike turned on him. Seconds later, Charles Oppenheer was lying on the ground, dead. Mike dragged the body into nearby brush and undergrowth to conceal it, making sure it wouldn't be immediately visible to anyone passing through the park, then got back in his car with Brooke still inside and drove away into the night. Just like that, a man was dead, a pregnant teenager was gone, and the park was quiet again. Days passed. Nobody reported Brooke or Charles missing immediately, which meant the police had no reason to investigate, no reason to go looking, no indication that anything had happened at all. It wasn't until someone spotted the couple's abandoned car that authorities started asking questions. They contacted Charles's parents, his co-workers, his acquaintances, anyone who might have seen him or known where he'd gone, but nobody had any information. Then, on July 16th, 4 days after the midnight encounter at Gezon Park, police searching the area discovered a body concealed in the undergrowth near the parking area. It was Charles. Now the investigation had a homicide and things moved faster. Detectives quickly learned about Charles's relationship with Brooke and the nature of the Craigslist ads, and they realized that Brooke was also missing, which meant they weren't dealing with an isolated killing but with a kidnapping as well, which is the kind of realization that makes every detective in the room sit up straighter because the clock is now ticking in a very different way. They obtained a warrant to search the couple's apartment, found their shared computer, and began digging through emails, messages, and browser history. That's where they discovered the correspondence with Mike's heart, a trail of messages that led from the Craigslist ads to a specific email address.
As far as the fund goes, though, there won't be any mail. Now, Ostrike later replies that he can swing $120.
The cybercrime unit traced that email address to a Facebook profile, and the profile didn't belong to anyone named Mike. It belonged to a man named Brady Ostrike. When police identified Ostrike and located his home address, they established surveillance on the property while they prepared a search warrant, which is standard procedure, the kind of methodical by-the-book approach that the legal system requires in order for evidence to be admissible in court. You can't just kick someone's door down because you have a bad feeling, even when every instinct you have is screaming that something terrible is happening inside that house. Around 9 p.m. on July 17th, while officers were still watching the house, Ostrike walked out, got in his car, and drove away. An officer attempted a traffic stop. Ostrike refused to pull over and fled, triggering a high-speed pursuit through residential streets that ended when Ostrike lost control of his vehicle and slammed into a concrete barrier. When officers cautiously approached the wrecked car to take him into custody, Ostrike produced a firearm and shot himself. The chase was over. The suspect was dead. And for a brief, horrible moment, the officers on scene probably thought the worst was behind them. Then they opened the trunk. Brooke Slocum was inside, 18 years old, 8 months pregnant, dead. But the horror didn't end there, because of course it didn't, because this case is one of those stories where every time you think you've reached the bottom, it just keeps going. When investigators finally entered Ostrike's house with a proper search warrant, what they found inside was evidence of something that had been meticulously planned and constructed over a long period of time, with a level of deliberation that made the already terrifying case exponentially worse. They catalogued over 400 individual pieces of evidence spread throughout the property: ropes, knives, swords, various restraint devices, a cage large enough to hold a person, and a basement that had been converted into what investigators could only describe as a purpose-built chamber designed for exactly the kind of thing that nobody wants to think about in any detail. The walls had been modified, the space had been organized. Everything about it suggested that Brady Ostrike hadn't stumbled into this crime impulsively. He'd been building toward it, preparing for it, constructing the physical infrastructure for it long before he ever responded to Brooke's Craigslist ad. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a project. But the thing that stood out most to investigators, the discovery that elevated this case from a horrific crime into a piece of lost media that authorities decided the world should never ever see, was the cameras. Brady Ostrike had installed multiple cameras throughout the basement and other areas of his house. He had recorded himself preparing the space, setting up the restraints, getting everything ready like he was filming a setup montage, and he had recorded everything, literally everything, that happened to Brooke during the 5 days she was held captive in that basement, chained up.
Ostrike is in the basement of his home on Taft Avenue in the city of Wyoming, hanging ropes from his ceiling, walking by with a chain, a padlock.
While the police above ground were methodically building their case, waiting for warrants, following legal procedure, doing everything by the book. And here's where this case becomes almost unbearable to sit with, so I need you to really understand the timeline here. While law enforcement was doing their jobs properly, going through the legal channels required to enter a private residence, building the evidentiary foundation needed to make a case that would hold up in court, following every protocol and procedure that the system demands, Brooke Slocum was alive in that basement. She was there. She was chained up. She was being recorded by a man who wanted to document what he was doing, and nobody got to her in time. By the time investigators had the legal authority to enter Brady Ostrike's house, the woman they were trying to find was already in the trunk of his car, dead. And the footage of what had happened to her over those 5 days was sitting on cameras in the basement, waiting to be discovered. That footage exists. Law enforcement viewed it as part of the investigation and the evidence processing, and they decided, with what I can only imagine was absolute unanimity, that nobody else should ever see it. It's evidence that documents 5 days of unimaginable suffering inflicted on a pregnant teenager by a man who was disturbed enough to set up cameras so he could watch it back later. And the decision to seal that footage away permanently is one of those exceedingly rare moments in the lost media conversation where the suppression of media feels less like a cover-up or a conspiracy, and more like an act of basic human decency. Mercy for Brooke's memory, for her family, for her unborn child who never had a chance, and honestly for anyone who might have stumbled across the footage if it had leaked onto the internet, the way these things inevitably seem to. This is lost media that was made lost on purpose, and honestly, good. Some things are simply too terrible to exist in the open, and anyone who disagrees can take a long walk off a short pier. Sharon Eugene Davis was a 51-year-old school teacher living in Dallas, Texas. She had 2 children, a daughter named Autumn and a son named Ronnie, and a husband of 21 years named Ron Davis, whom she'd married back in 1980. By all outward appearances, the Davis family was unremarkable. A middle-class household on Elderleaf Drive, a quiet residential street where neighbors waved at each other over fences and mowed their lawns on weekends, and nobody spent too much time thinking about what was happening behind anyone else's closed doors. Just another family on just another street in just another suburb in Texas. Nothing to see here. But Sharon's relationship with Ron was far from the picture of domestic stability that the neighborhood saw. As early as 1985, just 5 years into their marriage, Sharon had filed for divorce, describing Ron in court filings as controlling and ill-tempered, which are the legal system's polite words for things that are usually much, much worse behind closed doors. She'd withdrawn cash from their joint bank account and started making plans to relocate to Los Angeles with both children, the kind of drastic cross-country escape plan that tells you everything about how desperate someone is to get away. Moving from Dallas to LA with 2 kids isn't something you do on a whim. It's something you do when staying feels more dangerous than uprooting your entire life and starting over 3 states away with nothing but whatever you could fit in the car. But then, mysteriously, Sharon withdrew the divorce filing and returned to living with Ron. And if you're wondering why she went back, well, anyone who understands domestic abuse knows exactly how this happens and exactly why it keeps happening. The financial dependency, the fear, the manipulation, the promises to change, the exhaustion of fighting a battle nobody else can see, all of it. Sharon went back. And whatever happened in the 16 years between 1985 and 2001, she kept it to herself. Fast forward to June 11th, 2001. Sharon found the courage to file for divorce again, and this time she seemed determined to go through with it at any cost. She was making active plans to move out, her attorney was obtaining a temporary restraining order against Ron, and everything appeared to be falling into place for Sharon to finally escape a marriage that had been suffocating her for 2 decades. 20 years of whatever that household was, and she was finally getting out. 2 days later, on June 13th, at around 7 a.m., Sharon dropped her daughter off at a rapid transit park and ride station, about 2 miles from their home, and drove away toward her job. She was scheduled to attend a training session at STEM's elementary school that morning. She never arrived, she never called. She simply disappeared somewhere between the park and ride station and the school, a distance of just a few miles, during morning rush hour, in broad daylight. Gone. Just gone.
By all accounts, everyone really loved her, and then she just disappeared, poof, just off the face of the earth. She's just gone.
When Sharon's children tried to get their father to report her missing that evening, Ron refused. Let me say that again. His own wife hadn't come home, hadn't called, couldn't be reached, and his response was nothing. Just complete and total indifference to the fact that the mother of his children had vanished from the face of the earth. He didn't contact the authorities until a full day later, and by that point the most critical window for generating leads in a missing person case had already closed. If you know anything about missing persons investigations, you know that the first 24 hours are everything, and Ron Davis let those 24 hours tick away without lifting a finger. Make of that whatever you will. After 4 days of searching, investigators found Sharon's car abandoned in a parking lot near the Southwest Mall in Oak Cliff. The car had a broken window and had been meticulously wiped clean of fingerprints, which tells you immediately that whoever left that vehicle there was deliberate and methodical and understood exactly what kind of evidence the police would be looking for. Wiped clean, not there weren't any fingerprints.
Quite honestly, people just don't disappear. It's usually something bad's happened.
Wiped clean. There's a difference, and it's an important one. But despite how suspicious all of this was, despite the timing, despite the wiped clean car, despite the fact that Sharon had disappeared 48 hours after filing for divorce from a man she'd described as controlling, the lack of physical evidence meant her disappearance was classified as a missing person case rather than a homicide. Ron Davis was designated as a witness, although the lead investigator was candid enough to publicly acknowledge that Ron was an uncooperative witness and that foul play was feared. Everyone involved clearly believed something terrible had happened to Sharon, and everyone had a pretty good idea who might be responsible. But believing and proving are 2 completely different things, and in the American legal system, you can't arrest someone because everyone kind of thinks they did it. Months went by without any progress, and then something happened that could have changed everything. The producers of Unsolved Mysteries got interested in Sharon's story. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Unsolved Mysteries was basically the holy grail of cold case television, one of the most impactful programs ever created for the purpose of solving actual crimes. They'd present unsolved cases to a national audience of millions and provide a hotline for viewers to call in with tips. Over the course of its run, the show helped resolve hundreds of cases and generated thousands of leads. Hundreds. When Unsolved Mysteries aired your case, people watched, people remembered, people called in. Cold cases warmed up. Impossible leads materialized out of nowhere. That was the whole point of the show, and it worked spectacularly well. The producers created a full segment on Sharon's disappearance in late 2001 and scheduled it for broadcast in spring of 2002. Everything was ready. The interviews had been conducted, the research compiled, the segment produced and edited and ready to go. The last element they needed was a sit-down interview with Ron Davis. When the producers approached Ron, he refused, which is his legal right, fine, whatever. But then he went further. When the producers told him they intended to air the segment without his participation, because of course they would, because that's what the show does, he objected aggressively, sending a letter described as accusatory and threatening in tone, explicitly demanding that they kill the episode. Not, I'd rather not participate. Not, I have concerns about the portrayal. Kill the episode. Make it go away. Make sure nobody ever sees it. And here's the part that makes this story genuinely, deeply, infuriatingly maddening. The showrunners complied. They scrapped the entire segment, shelved the footage, walked away. As far as anyone has been able to determine, that episode has never seen the light of day. The husband of a missing woman, the guy the police themselves called uncooperative, sent a threatening letter and the network just folded. They folded like a cheap lawn chair. Think about what that means for a second. A woman disappears under deeply suspicious circumstances 2 days after filing for divorce. Her husband refuses to cooperate with police, delays reporting her missing by 24 hours, and is publicly labeled an uncooperative witness. A television show with a proven, documented, verified track record of solving cold cases produces an episode designed to generate leads. And the husband, the same man who refused to cooperate with investigators, successfully pressures the network into killing the episode before it ever airs. Somewhere out there, someone might have seen something on the morning of June 13th, 2001. Maybe they saw Sharon's car being driven by someone other than Sharon. Maybe they noticed something at the parking lot where the car was found. Maybe they saw something that seemed insignificant at the time, but would have clicked into place the instant they saw Sharon's face on television. That witness, that tip, that phone call to the Unsolved Mysteries hotline that could have cracked the case wide open. It never happened. Because the episode never aired. Because Ron Davis told them to kill it, and they did. Ron earned nicknames from people who followed the case. Things like the most guilty non-guilty man in Dallas. More than 20 years have passed. Sharon Davis has never been found. No one has ever been charged. And the Unsolved Mysteries episode that was designed to do exactly what the show did best, the thing the show was literally built to do, remains locked away, unseen, as lost as the woman it was supposed to help find. And that's the thing about lost media connected to real crimes and real human lives. Every piece of footage that's been hidden or destroyed or lost represents a moment where the truth was captured and then taken away. And the question that haunts every one of these cases is always the same. Who benefits from the truth being hidden? And what would change if the world could finally see what was recorded? Some of these tapes were hidden by institutions protecting themselves. Some were destroyed by people who knew exactly what was on them and couldn't afford for anyone else to find out. Some are out there right now, sitting in a box in someone's basement or in a pile of unlabeled VHS tapes in an attic somewhere, waiting for someone to pick them up and realize what they're holding. And that's the real horror of lost media. It's not that the tapes are gone, it's that the truth went with them.